This is Jose Merino, Editor-in-Chief of the Neurology family of journals. The Neurology podcast provides practical information to neurologists and other clinicians to help them provide better care for their patients. Thanks for listening and have a great week.
Hi, this is Tesha Monteith with the Neurology podcast. We have a very special program today. We're going to reflect on the life and leadership of Ralph Sacco. As many of you know, he served as the 35th president of the American Academy of Neurology from 2017 to 2019, and unfortunately passed away on January 17th due to a brain tumor. I know Dr. Sacco personally because he was my mentor as chairman of neurology at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine, professor of neurology of public health sciences, human genetics and neurosurgery, as well as executive director of the Evelyn McKnight Brain Institute. With me to discuss this amazing individual is Orly Avitzur, president of the American Academy of Neurology and editor of Brain and Life magazine, and Mitch Elkind, professor of neurology and epidemiology at Columbia University. He's also the current chief clinical science officer and past president of the American Heart Association. Thank you both for being here. How are you?
Well, thank you.
Terrific. Thank you.
When thinking about this podcast that I knew we had to do, you were the first people that came to my mind because he spoke so highly of both of you and really depended on both of you so much, maybe in a little bit of different ways. And can you both tell me how you first met Dr. Sacco?
I first met Ralph back in 1995 when I went to interview for a stroke fellowship at Columbia. And I didn't actually go to meet him initially. I went to meet with his mentor, J.P. Moore, who was running the stroke service at Columbia at that time. And when I was talking to Dr. Moore, he said, if you really want to learn how to do clinical research and do it really well, you should talk to the guy at the other end of the hall. His name is Ralph Sacco. So I went down the hall and I met Ralph, and he told me about this neuroepidemiology training program that he was involved in, a 2-year fellowship. I was immediately just drawn in by his enthusiasm, his excitement. He was just so energetic, and this sounded like a great way to learn not only epidemiology, but how to do clinical research. And so as I kind of sat there and talked with him, I thought, wow, this is somebody who I could really learn a lot from and who I would like to spend some time with. And so I signed up for the fellowship and joined him the following year. And we've had a great 30-year relationship academically, professionally, and as close friends as well. So that's how I came to know Ralph Orly.
I met Ralph in 2012 when I joined the board of directors of the American Academy of Neurology. And I was the chair of the Medical Economics and Management Committee. Ralph, at that point, was already vice president of the board of directors in the AAN. And during an early dinner at that time, he sat next to me, and I was so excited because I had heard so much about him over the years, but had never had the opportunity to have a conversation with him one-on-one. And during that conversation, he told me all about him, and not really about his academic side, but rather his hobbies, his passion for building and designing houses. And he showed me photos of his house, later called Project Number 10, which I would visit years later in Miami. And we had a wonderful time. I remember laughing so much during that first conversation that the next day my cheeks hurt just from so many hours of having so much fun with Ralph Sacco. And we continued to meet at the board of directors every couple of months for the next 11 years or so. And Ralph would invite me on all our time that we had, which was not meeting time, to join him on various trips and excursions. And so we traveled a great deal together, and I got to know him better and better over time.
Dr. Sacco as a mentor and just kind of being down the hall from me, I feel like I've learned so much about him, like his disco dancing. Can you share some of your favorite memories of Ralph?
So probably my favorite memories were some of those trips because Ralph would always encourage me to do things I would never think of on my own. He took me up on a helicopter above the volcanoes in Hawaii. He took me through some caves that were bat infested on one occasion on an island. We went go-kart riding together in big city traffic where Ralph had to drive on the wrong side of the street and I had to navigate. We had tons of adventures, but the most memorable and the one I'll always keep close to my heart is when he took me to visit and meet his family in July of last year. He grew up in Margate City in New Jersey, and he took me to his family home to meet his father, who is 92, and all his siblings, and to take a tour of his high school, go to his favorite beach, and have a Sacco sub, which his dad made for me himself.
That's great. I actually did get a Sacco sub myself at their store near Atlantic City several years ago when I gave a talk down there, and I knew that's where Ralph was from and had heard all about Sacco subs, and so went to the store and met his brother there and got one of their subs, which I would add was delicious. So, it's funny, everybody always brings up his dancing too. He was an amazing dancer, and I know everybody always wanted to get a chance to dance with him. For me, I didn't take so many exciting helicopter rides as Orly, but I remember something that seemed kind of emblematic of Ralph, which was one day when I know he was on a call with a bunch of leaders of a global clinical trial that he was in charge of, and they were having teleconference. And, these were all the top stroke neurologists in the world, not just the U.S., and immediately after coming off that call, he walked over to a small table in his office and sat down with a medical student and went over a paper with the medical student. And I was just blown away by the fact that this guy who had so many demands upon him from, American Academy of Neurology, American Heart Association, clinical trials he was running, NIH, his own, patients and everything else, was able to find the time to sit down for an hour with a student to go over that student's project. It said to me that, keep this in mind, that no matter where you go in your career as we advance and, we accumulate responsibilities and opportunities, just don't forget that there are others who are making their way up that same ladder, and being supportive and helpful to them is important. And that's kind of a lesson that I learned from him at that time.
Yeah, I agree. He's mentored so many people and has really just had an impact in just so many ways. What do you think his legacy is?
Ralph spoke a lot to me about his legacy after he was diagnosed with the glioblastoma. It was extremely important to him to leave a mark on the world, and we had so many discussions in the last 16 months or so of his life over what that meant to him. Mitch and I are working together currently on one aspect of his legacy. Ralph was very passionate about brain health. And because he worked on cardiovascular health at the American Heart Association, he envisioned a collaboration between the AAN and the AHA on brain health. And he mapped out how he'd like us to work together after his death and focus on brain health to bring it to public awareness. And that's something that we've just begun to have discussions on. And I hope to see that it leaves a big imprint. And more important than that, he also left us to both organization bequests so that we could execute that work well and really bring it to fruition.
I agree. I had the chance to speak with Ralph on several occasions before he passed. And as Orly said, he made that clear that he wanted us to push forward in the area of brain health. I would also add that I think one of his legacies is his emphasis on the importance of diversity and inclusion in neurology. And he really brought that to life, I think, at both the American Academy of Neurology and at the American Heart Association. But most recently, and where I experienced it most, was in his role as editor-in-chief of the journal Stroke, which he took over probably about a year and a half or so before he got sick. And he made it his mission to increase the proportion of women and people from underrepresented groups on the editorial board of Stroke. And he didn't just say that, but he had metrics, and he made sure that we improved and we stuck to those metrics. And, he was very, very proud, I would say, of the fact that we did have 50% women on the editorial board and that there were many, many people of color on the board. And I think he felt the same way about doing that in the field in general and in the leadership of both organizations. And I think that, again, was just sort of an indication of how broad-minded he was and how much he respected people and how much he cared about people who didn't start out with all of the advantages, and saw it as part of his mission and his legacy to make those opportunities available to everybody. And that was another lesson, I think, that he taught certainly me and taught all of us.
Another part of his legacy was bringing the academic initiative to the American Academy of Neurology. He had the vision that there would be support for department chairs, division directors, and every member really of the academic department to do their work. And he saw it as a committee with subcommittees, and he had a fully developed vision for how to help departments succeed. And it came at a really great time because the committee was put into place, or at least the beginnings of it, just before the pandemic. And during the pandemic, he was able to bring together department chairs to share information on how to use best practices, deal with common threats and challenges. And he was visionary in that regard.
And his publication record is just phenomenal. The Northern Manhattan study, which many of us have participated in, really have, I think, contributed a lot to our current understanding of stroke epidemiology.
Yeah, Ralph was a leader in stroke epidemiology, and his focus was on disparities, and particularly the increased risk in stroke in the Dominican immigrant community of Northern Manhattan. And that was his passion project in many ways. He was junior faculty member when he initially got the Northern Manhattan study funded, and he continued to run the study even after he had moved to the University of Miami, and we had a very close collaboration on it. It's funny, though, when I think about the study overall and its kind of 30-year history thus far, it actually started out as the Northern Manhattan Stroke Study, and it was focused on stroke. And then the second iteration of it, it became a case control study where we began to enroll people from the community as a control group to compare to people who were admitted with strokes. And then the next iteration of the grant cycle, it expanded to become essentially like a prospective cohort study of the people of Northern Manhattan, much like the Framingham heart study, the famous heart epidemiologic study that started back in 1948. And when I think about how the study moved from focusing only on stroke to eventually this kind of broad prospective study looking at a range of outcomes, including dementia and cardiac events and so forth. And I talk to people about that. I always say, that it was so amazing how Ralph was able to kind of bootstrap. He was a junior faculty member. He never could have gotten funding to do this prospective Framingham-like study when he started, because who was he at that point? Nobody knew who he was. But he started small with a focus study, and he leveraged that grant, every 5 years with new grant opportunities into this major powerhouse of his study. When I used to say to him, Ralph, it's so amazing that you did that, how you saw where this was going in the beginning and made that happen. And he would just laugh and say, Mitch, I didn't think of it that way. I just started with, what was available at the time. And then I saw what opportunities were there and I took the next step and then the next step from there. And so it really grew much more organically. And I always think of that as a great lesson for people who are starting out in research careers, that you don't have to know where this is going to end. Ultimately, we look up and we see our mentors and the professors and, they have things that have been going on for 20, 30 years. And it seems like, a mountain too high to climb. But if you just start with that initial first step, that first insight, and then look where it leads you, you can take many, many smaller steps, baby steps even, that ultimately get you to the top of that mountain. And so I saw a lot of humility in the way he put it, but he was really right. That's how to go about it, is just one small step at a time. And I thought that was another great lesson.
As you say, he was a very accomplished neurologist, researcher, and academic leader, being a president of both the American Heart Association and the American Academy of Neurology. As society leaders yourselves, do you have any insight on how that was possible?
I met Gerard Costi, who was his roommate at BU Medical School, and we had several long conversations. And I asked Gerard, what was Ralph like back in medical school? And he said he had a photographic memory. It would frustrate his roommate a great deal because Ralph could sit there with music blasting, rocking in his rocking chair, and retain every bit of information in the medical textbooks, whereas his roommate Gerard had to go to the library and read things repeatedly, he said. And so it had me looking at Ralph in a whole new light. I think he did have an incredible mind. He was incredibly bright and incredibly interested in the material he read as well. And he also loved his work. And when you love your work, it doesn't seem to be that way. And it's possible to do it in long stretches and still be excited and accomplish a great deal. And I think he was able to do all of that, some because of his innate skills, some because of his passion for neurology, and much because he just wanted to be the best that he could be. And he had very high standards for himself.
And I might just add, I know that as an undergraduate, he was an electrical engineering major. And I remember asking him about that when I was a fellow. And he would talk about how those skills, kind of the engineering skills, breaking things down, looking at how one thing relates to another, how to put things back together. I think he was gifted in that way. If he hadn't been a neurologist, he could have been an engineer, he could have been, an architect perhaps. And he was very good at seeing how things fit together and building them. And I think instead of building with, bricks or with, electrical components and transistors, he was also a humanist. So he kind of wedded that engineering mind to his humanist mind. And he was, in a sense, building with people. He loved to build programs. He liked to bring people together. He liked to bring organizations together. He was passionate about bringing together the AAN and the AHA. And that's, as Orly said, one of his legacies. And so he was a builder fundamentally. And I think that's what allowed him to be such a great leader.
It was also those analytic skills that served him really well when he looked for a summer job while he was at BU. He was able to meet with Phil Wolfe, who became his mentor, and Dr. Wolfe was involved in the Framingham study. So Ralph began to work on computer cards at the time. It was very tedious sorting work. And I think all that experience by the time he graduated set him up really nicely for the work he did in New York. And before he even got to New York, he had published his first paper in the journal Neurology, and it was something he was very proud of, as well as a couple other papers. So he really got a great kickstart from the time he was a medical student.
So clearly he had more than the average, but he still was a hard worker. How do you think he balanced work-life?
I think he worked extremely hard, but he also had a really great sense of friends and family and how important that was to his life. So when he was a resident, he worked extremely hard during the week. And on the weekends, he would go out to the Hamptons, where he had an ever-growing community of friends. And he really enjoyed having a great time as well. As I mentioned, he loved the beach. He loved to sail. He got involved in construction and design projects quite early on, and at the end had designed 11 houses over the course of his lifetime. He played hard and he worked hard, and he brought such a joie de vivre to every single thing he did. He was just a joy to be around.
Is there anything you want the world to know about him?
For me, it would be that he had the kindest heart of anyone I've ever met and had absolutely no judgment about people. I have never heard him criticize anyone. I have only heard him come from a place of compassion and understanding. He made everyone he met want to be better because he was such an incredible human being.
Yeah, I agree with that. He was extremely generous. He thought about others. He was so encouraging to me and to, many of us at Columbia and at University of Miami, as you know, Tesha. He was just such a great person to go to for advice. He was really the first person I would go to with any questions I had. And I remember when I told him that I was considering moving to the American Heart Association to take a full-time position there. And he was extremely encouraging and validating of that. In fact, I think I may have even detected a hint of envy in his voice. It felt like this was something he thought was important, and he was glad that one of his mentees, one of his trainees, was going to be moving in that direction to kind of fulfill one of the steps that he thought was important in developing the field of brain health further at the Heart Association. So I think he just had a really big vision and a great way to engage others in that mission and vision as well. And I was delighted to be a colleague and friend of his and to be part of that vision as well.
If you're able to share, can you let us know the last interaction you had with him, last meaningful interaction?
So for me, it was the weekend before he passed away. I had been traveling to the Hamptons for a few days every other week or so throughout his illness when he moved there in late August. And he was remarkable throughout his entire illness. He was quite aware. His brain was fully functional. He still was able to laugh a great deal and enjoy life. I had been invited to spend Christmas with Ralph and 26 Saccos, which was a real high point for me. I sat between Ralph and his dad, who is one of the most charming people I've ever met. And Ralph just maintained his self, his personality, his joy, his happiness throughout the time of those very difficult months. I remember at one point he said to me, "Orly, I'm experiencing parakinesia brachialis ossitans." And that is really what he had. And I looked at him. I was astonished that he was still so sharp, as that probably took place in the last month or two of his life. The last time I saw him, when he was no longer having conversations, he winked at me and letting me know that he knew I was there, and he smiled at friends and family. He was surrounded by tremendous love. When they say you can feel palpable love in a room, that was the last few months of Ralph's life. He was surrounded by friends and family and just people who had taken part in his life, who begged to come see him and talk to him. And he very generously made space for everyone. It was one of the most awesome and meaningful experiences that I've ever had.
I got to spend time with him in December as well, when he was quite physically disabled, but as Orly has said, very cognitively intact. And it was really a sad but gratifying experience. I was very grateful to have that day with him, essentially, to kind of review, what we'd done together in our relationship and what he hoped for me and for the field of neurology in the future. It was a really special time. And I was just incredibly impressed by Ralph's ability to think outwardly at a time when he was really, so ill. And he, I think, never hid. He was out in the open about his illness. I think for, a neurology audience that may be listening to this, I think that's, very relevant. He knew what was coming because he had a glioblastoma, and we all know what a terrible illness that is. But he was able to engage, I think, and reflect on his life and plan for the future and plan his bequests to the organizations he admired and loved, and think about his husband, Scott, and think about his family and the planning. He was just so thoughtful. And so I think, he certainly taught us how to live in many ways, but I think he also taught us how to say goodbye through his openness and his generosity with his own experiences. And I really admired that in him tremendously.
And what will you remember most about him?
For me, it will be his friendship and the gift of absolute trust that he gave me throughout his illness. About a month after he was diagnosed, he called me. He told me he had just prepared his will, and that told me a little bit about the bequests he was leaving, but he also had left me something personal, and that was a gift of audio tapes that he created about his thoughts. And I was so moved by that. He put them in a Dropbox account. He told me where they would be after he passed away. And as time went on, we converted those audio tapes to videotapes, and I got to spend a long time speaking to Ralph, and he entrusted me to do with those tapes whatever I felt would be best. And I will never forget that kind of gift. It meant the world to me.
I would say that I will remember his leadership skills, and I think I will always endeavor to live up to the model that he set for us. And I really appreciated his mentorship and his friendship, and was fortunate to have worked with him for so many years.
Well, thank you both for being here on the podcast and helping us reflect on the wonderful and incredible life of Dr. Ralph Sacco.
Thank you, Tesha, for the opportunity to participate in this.
Thank you very much.
As discussed, Ralph Sacco's work is not done, and he has left us with some clear plans to move forward that will continue into the future as part of his legacy. To wrap up this podcast, we leave you with some of Ralph's thoughts on the critical importance of mentorship, in his own words, from his AAN presidential plenary session.
Each of us has a personal journey. And I urge you all to think about your own personal motivations of what got you into the field, what maybe inspired you to be a neurologist. My own journey began as a bioelectrical engineer, thinking about the nervous system as a circuit, working with those electrical engineering diagrams. Going on to medical school, mentorship was critical. Mentoring medical students, getting them excited about careers in neurology. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Phil Wolfe, who taught me the neurological exam, who exposed me to neurology, who actually got me interested in the Framingham Heart Study, where epidemiology became part of my career. As a medical student, he then introduced me to the next step of my career as a resident and a fellow when I met J.P. Moore. And he taught me to continually question what we take as dogma, and continue to look for evidence to prove what we're doing is right. Those mentorship opportunities are critical for all of us to inspire others to get interested in fields of neurology. Collaborations and teamwork has always been critical to me in my research, in helping lead the Department of Neurology at the University of Miami, in working with the American Academy of Neurology. It's much more fun and innovative to work in teams, to tackle challenges, and to find new ways forward. I remain excited about our future, and all of us need to work together and think about the challenges that we have ahead and the opportunities that that provides for us. We need to continue to provide hope for the increasing and growing numbers of neurologic patients. That is an important challenge and opportunity for us.
And thank you for listening to this very special edition of the Neurology Podcast.